Robert Littal from blacksportsonline.com, and I have a special guest today. Is Kavitha Davidson, the host of the Sportify, is it Sportly podcast, excuse me,
Importantly.
through Immigrant Media. I know everybody knows Kavitha. She's been pretty much on everything, the athletic, real sports, ESPN, Bloomberg. I think I saw a feature in Rolling Stone. So this is someone that has been around sports media, been empowerment for women's sports for many years. Someone that I've known for a long time and very impressed with, and glad that she actually took the time out to speak with me today. How are you doing today, Kavita? I hope you're having a great day.
I'm doing all right, Robert. Thank you so much. It's good to talk to you after all this time, but it's good to catch up for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're still here. That's always
We
a
are
good
still
thing
here.
in these crazy times. The first question I wanted to ask you is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. I felt like after or during the pandemic and then coming out of the pandemic, there was this really boom in interest in women's sports. What do you attribute that to? And how can we as fans and media and athletes, I would imagine, kind of keep that momentum going?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it was because of the pandemic. I think the timing lined up there for sure. The WNBA in particular and college women's basketball and soccer, obviously, with the women's national team, has been doing the work for many years now. And you've obviously seen this giant boom in the last few years. But if you go back and you look at the numbers in the last 5 to 10, you've also just seen sustained growth, sustained ratings growth, interest, coverage. It's all related, right? The fact that you and I are talking about this now is a symptom, but also an indicator, right? So I think you had all of those things around 2020 that came together. I will say though that one of the things that I did notice in the pandemic, and I was hosting the Athletics Daily podcast during that time. And, all of us who were in the sports world, we didn't have sports for many months. So we were like reaching for content and reaching to try and find points of coverage. And I think a lot of us pointed out that, listen, we are so starved for sports and we are so, and we saw what the loss of them really did to us that if you're not willing to watch women's sports now, which are at the highest level than they've ever been and are purely fundamentally enjoyable, then you're probably not really a sports fan. And I think a lot of people saw that void and filled it rightfully with some women's sports.
This is something that I think a lot of male fans have struggled with. And I've actually spoke to a few that asked me this question, and I'm like, I'm not, I'm a man, I'm not the right one to ask the question to. So I will bring it, to you, so maybe we can bring that to them. Is the discussion on how to deal with women's sports in regards to men's sports from a fan perspective, I felt, especially during this WNBA season, um, is a little complicated and a little bit muddled. And I just give you an example of someone that I talked to recently. He said if LeBron misses, 19 threes in a row, and we make fun of him and we call him LeBrick, and there's YouTube videos about it. No one really, they take it with a grain of salt. They take it more as comedy. If Angel Reese misses several layups in a row and we say something, about her in jest or in funny, and we know there's a line that shouldn't be crossed, we get branded, certain stereotypes about men that watch women's sports. How do you bridge that gap when there are new fans, and a lot of those new fans are men who are used to watching men's sports and talking about men's sports a certain way, to do it in a respectful way, but also where you're getting treated, equally, which is what I assume that the women athletes want.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, the women athletes absolutely do want that, and they when they deserve to be clowned on, they should be clowned on, and all of that. And if you look at the trash talk between the women, it's amazing. Honestly, it's one of my favorite parts of the W. But I think with like in that comparison, and I hear you when you say like if Angel Reese is missing a bunch of shots. she should like in good fun be made fun of for that, the way that a LeBron would. I think the difference is that historically, not Angel Reese herself, but historically women in this game have not on the other side been given the praise when they are playing extremely well the way that LeBron has, right? So those two things are really important to keep in mind. I will say just also like for style of play though, like I'm a 90s kid. I grew up with the 90s Knicks and I have a lot of friends who do not like the way the NBA is being played right now, just with small ball and outside shooting and the loss of real post play. And if that's your style of play, that's what's happening in the W right now. But I do understand when fans get frustrated that they think that, the same kind of like rhetoric or language that we would use toward men is not acceptable to use toward women. And the other thing I'll say on that is I think there's a lot of stuff that's said toward men that is also out of bounds. So like we should call that out, right? And like I said, the praise has not come in the same level historically toward the women. But when we are talking about the women right now, we are also in many cases talking about social media vitriol that veers into actual dangerous hate speech, actual threats in a way that some of the men do get, but they just don't get it at the same level as the women. And I think that's important to acknowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you ever quite seen anything like Caitlin Clark? I got on to Caitlin Clark probably maybe her sophomore year because she's in the Big Ten, and I'm a Buckeye, and I remember Ohio State, the women were playing Iowa, and I had never seen her play before, and I was just fascinated about what I saw on the court. It looked so different than kind of what you're usually seeing, and so I kind of saw this organic ascent. But even I, in my Magic, 8 ball, didn't quite feel like it was going to be what it actually was. Some of that is absolutely amazing. Others, not so much in the way it was politicized and some of the other things that was going on. Have you ever seen a woman athlete just have this kind of polarizing effect, not just on a league, but on kind of sports in general, like Caitlin Clark did kind of over these past 12 to 24 months?
I think that it's an interesting question because we tend to have short memories when we're talking about things like that, right? So if you're talking about the talent level, obviously, like you can't deny that we have never seen a player put up the kind of numbers that Clayton Clark has in the men's or women's game, right? And that's completely undeniable. And it's not just about her shooting. She's an incredible passer, and that's a part of her game that I think goes unnoticed a lot. But I will say that, I think it's a kind of cliche thing, but it's a real thing in today of media and social media. Everything is heightened and everything is louder. So the polarization in general is a lot more than I think we've ever had the channels and the outlets to amplify. And everything is rooted in our identities and our political stances. So I think that Caitlin Clark, through no fault of her own, has become this lightning rod for a lot of conversations that people want to have about other things, but they're using her in order to have those conversations.
And on a flip side of that, you have, Angel Reese. And like you said, through no fault of Caitlin Clark, of her own, she has a certain amount of cover because she is, white. There are certain things that come into play for all of us who are black men, black women, black athletes. Angel Reese is someone that is also a bit of a lightning rod. But I spoke about yesterday how she has taken basketball, but she has turned it into this kind of multi organizational, the podcast. She's with Rihanna. She's really becoming a superstar that we normally only see from the men. You see, LeBron doing movies or Odell Beckham, at Fashion Week or something. You normally haven't seen that kind of breakthrough crossover star with black female, athletes. Do you see her as kind of a trend setter with that? And is it something that, with Juju Watkins and others that are coming up behind her, that when we look back on this, we're gonna be like, hey, Andrew Reese started something that, like Steph started something, like Jordan started something, like one of those type of athletes.
Well, I think we've all got to remember that Serena Williams exists, to be honest. Like, I
Absolutely,
mean, just
absolutely, absolutely.
as far as the businesswoman, standpoint, right? Like, she's, Serena is a team owner and has a media empire of her own, and all of that. I mean, but absolutely, I think it's incredible what Angel Reese is doing, and I think what we're seeing with Angel Reese is a natural continuation of what we've seen in the last few years of athletes, men and women, realizing that even when they make their bag on the court, they need to have something set up for when they stop playing, whether that's because of injury or because of retirement, right? And so we see players up and down the line, whether it's a LeBron or a lesser known player, who are starting these enterprises. And I think that also a lot of players, this is something that I very much appreciate from the younger generation. A lot of players, and I don't know if this is Angel Reese's attitude, but a lot of players don't see their sport as their be all and end all. It's something that they obviously love to do and they've committed to doing to the level that they've reached these, 0.1% of stars, but they also have lives outside of their sports. And I think as fans, sometimes we don't want to acknowledge that that's the case. I was talking to Martellus and Michael Bennett at the Super Bowl a few years ago, and they were like, for us, football was a means to an end. We want to be writers, we want to be creators, we want to be all of these other things. So, I mean, I think if someone like Angel Reese, who again is at the top of her game, is also able to parlay that into some future, we also forget that these people are 20 years old. They got another 60 years, 40 to 60 years of being on this earth and working. So she's setting herself up for that future. And I think that's great to see. And I do think that it's a path that you'll see a lot of other athletes taking, in particular women athletes.
So we talked about like the fans. I want to get a little bit into the media. For a very long time, if you wanted to cover, women's sports, it was a lower level, of media. They didn't talk about it at the top of Sports Center. They didn't talk about it at the top of First Take. It wasn't trending on social media. That changed. I would say in the last year or two. But the individuals that are at the top of the game, so to speak, carry a lot of weight and a lot of clout in how they talk about sports, even if it's from a opinion based situation. And the industry is still, even though we've come a long way, still the majority male, majority white male. What did you see that you liked and maybe that you disliked from media in the way that this coverage happened once it kind of all got into the mainstream?
Yeah, so first on the things that I like that more, obviously more people are at these games, more people are covering it. I like that you've got, Sports Center top 10 plays that are coming from women's sports and from the W. All of that came because of, direct business decisions that were made. I'm a former ESPNW writer, and I can tell you that there were always people at ESPN who thought that the W was worth covering and did cover it, but the programming decisions come from far up above. So ESPN now has these, very lucrative broadcast rights deals. That means that they have a financial incentive to cover these sports because they have seen value in covering these sports, which they should have done, and which every outlet, frankly, should have done 10 to 15, 20 years ago. Those of us who have been on this side of the table have said you are literally leaving money on the table by not covering women's sports. The things that I haven't liked, I think that a lot of people, it's going to be the same kind of things, which are, it's a good thing that more people are in the room now. But, and I'm not very pro gatekeeping the people who are covering these sports. But I think that you also have a lot of people who haven't done the work. And by that, I don't mean you haven't been in the room before. I mean, you haven't done your research. I mean, you don't know the history. You don't understand the conversations that have been happening in the last 10 to 20 years in this league. And so when you come in with a lot of really hot takes and opinions that are not based in conversations that were already happening for people around the league, they can come off as disingenuous or as just kind of trying to clout chase or to engagement farm or that kind of thing, right? And the other thing I'll say is, well, I think it's fantastic that there are a lot of outlets, not just ESPN, but a lot of outlets, newspapers and local outlets that are covering women's sports now. I think they're trying to play catch up and they're still not putting the resources into it. The salaries are still lower for those reporters. Not all of them travel to games. There are a lot of structural things that still need to catch up, but I think it will get there.
Yeah, it's a it's a good thing that more people are talking about it. So the more voices, I always say, the more opinions, the better. So you can kind of fester out, what you don't want to listen to. But with those more eyes, I guess some of the issues that maybe hadn't gotten a lot of coverage before is now getting a lot of coverage. I mean, we've seen the accusations with the Seattle Storm, for example, of Drew Lloyd asking for a trade. There were situations with the Las Vegas Aces. So some of these kind of underbelly things of the WNBA and I guess women's sports in general, that things that men don't have to worry about, pregnancy, for example, or men necessarily don't have to worry about some of the harassment, things of that nature. With those kind of underbelly things, coming to light at a time where there's so much spotlight on it. Um, how do you feel that that stuff is being covered? And do you feel that because it's being covered more, that some of these things that have been happening in WNBA and other women's sports would get maybe cleaned up a bit as they get more mainstream?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll say that I come at this from a journalist and reporter's perspective, right? I am somebody who loves women's basketball. I am a fan. I have always advocated for more coverage of women's basketball, but I am at my core a journalist and reporter. So with that means that when there are negative stories, we've got to cover them the way that we would cover the way that we would cover positive stories and the way that we would cover negative stories coming out of men's leagues, which I've made a bit of a career doing. Um, so, and the other thing I'll say is, like you said, like there are a lot of things that men's leagues might not have to deal with their players, certainly with female employees, right? But not necessarily with their players. That, for example, the W has been at the forefront of having written into player contracts, hopefully protections for maternity leave and having daycare provided and things like that for players that they've been quite progressive with. But that being said, one thing that I've always said is just because a league is run by women doesn't mean they're going to fall into the same traps as the men. Like there is no inherent virtue of a league that is run by women. We just happen to deal with different things and we might think of things in a different way and come up with solutions in a different way. So I think that it's really important to keep, as journalists, as people who cover these leagues, to keep covering them the way that we would cover the men's sports and to keep bringing light these kinds of accusations, these kinds of things. And it's obviously not just the W. We've seen a lot of this in women's soccer too. We've seen a lot of abuse and a lot of and kind of and a lot of obviously pay discrepancy and things like that. I think that there's a tension right now between people and under this media umbrella, we all need each other, but a lot of us serve different purposes, right? So we've got media personalities, we've got entertainers, we've got journalists and reporters. There is some overlap sometimes, but they are distinct buckets of what they do. And I think what we're dealing with right now is a desire under the larger media umbrella to continue to support the coverage of women's sports. Alongside the desire to cover women's sports as the business entities that they are and as seriously as we cover men's sports.
Yeah, so that's perfectly said. I mean, it's very good. 2024 was quite a year for various reasons. Is also anytime there's an election year, that's always a lot that's going on, and then you kind of add this aspect of this blowing up of women's sports. Going into 2025, in your ideal world, where do you see women's sports going? Where do you see the WNBA going, especially with them, opting out of their CBA and the TV rights deal? And how do you hope that we all, kind of as a society, I think that is especially the ones that have kind of first got their taste of how talented these individuals are in women's sports. Going forward, what do you think the best outcome would be for everyone?
I mean, the W is just going to continue to rise. Like it's just a given. This is momentum that can't be stopped, right? I'm a Liberty fan, and things are pretty bright here in New York, but they're bright around the league, right? We've got expansion coming up. We've got expansion over the next few years, which is great. The CBA negotiations are going to be really interesting to follow, because labor negotiations are contentious no matter the sport, and this goes back to what we were just talking about. It doesn't matter if you're men or women. There's a labor versus management struggle here, and the players are going to be fighting for what they believe and they do deserve, right? Especially with this huge influx of money that is now coming in with the new broadcast deal and all of that. So that's going to be a really important thing to look for. And I think the hope is that the players will be compensated in a way that reflects not just their talent, but also the future and the growth that this league is having. Not to get too political, but I think that one thing that I really do want to look out for is Title IX protections. If, this incoming administration has promised to dismantle the Department of Education and they are in charge of enforcing Title IX. And I don't know what happens if that does happen. So that's something that I'm a little bit afraid of and looking for. And then just the continued growth along every sport, not just basketball and soccer and kind of the big ones. We saw unprecedented viewership of the NCAA volleyball tournament, just this week. And we're seeing women's baseball starting. We're seeing huge growth in people watching gymnastics. Alexis Ohanian is investing in a track and field league to kind of capitalize on the sports that do really well during the Olympics every 4 years, but hopefully sustaining them year to year. So I think that those are the things that I'm looking for. And I'll tell you that those are the things where big money people in Silicon Valley and on Wall Street are looking for too, because women's sports is the best point of entry for anybody who wants to be a team owner right now. And that's where a lot of people are looking. And it's really, really exciting to see.
Well, I really appreciate you taking out the time. I just wanted to kind of. I think there's a lot of fans or a lot of guys that are fans of women's sports, but sometimes they're a little afraid of how to approach it and how to have their fandom, felt because of the way social media and things are. And I really think you've given a lot of education to them and to myself, as well going forward. Thank you so much for your time. Continue to shine. I know we see you everywhere. And if you ever need anything, of course, from me or BSO, you feel free to let me know.